Hello everyone, this is Irina. I'm a historian and a history teacher with a small channel on YouTube where I usually talk about Norse stuff or aspects regarding the culture and languages of the Scandinavian and German space. And today I have for you an interesting, hopefully interesting piece on runes, the magical qualities of runes as well as the misuse in the 19th and 20th century. So hope you enjoy my talk, and there we go. So the earliest inscriptions have been dated to the 1st century AD, and from then until about the 16th century, runic inscriptions were carved on all kinds of objects for all kinds of purposes. The simplest messages involve just the name of the owner scratched onto an object such as a piece of jewelry or even comps and drinking horse and all kinds of other objects. Most public runic inscriptions on monuments such as gravestones are not confined to the pagan period only, as there are plenty of Christian inscriptions as well. And it is worth bearing in mind that the inscribed objects that survived tend to be significant in themselves. They are carefully crafted articles or great monumental sculptures. And because of this, there has occurred this idea that runes themselves were in some way magical, and they were associated to some kind of powers or energies they lend to the objects themselves. This impression of magic and mystery was mostly swept away in the second half of the 20th century, when in Norway at least, especially in the area around Bergen, there have been discoveries of hundreds of runic inscriptions, many of them on bits of wood, which were actually very trivial in matter. So they were like name tags or business letters, something like that. All right, but like I said before, this idea of magic associated with runes is a pretty potent one. This is also due to the fact that magic always or almost always involves language, so you just need to think of spells, magic words, curses present in not only different cultures of the world but also in popular culture nowadays. So it is not surprising that there are some runic inscriptions which do seem to have been designed in order to perform some kind of magical function. But we need to pay attention when we interpret these kinds of runes, because some of them which are doubled, for example, you can have a double rune or some kind of incomprehensible joining of the runes. This can also be the result of a job gone bad, as well as the simple fact of runes having a decorative function. But on the other hand, there are inscriptions which have been plainly designed to have a magical function, and we can give here two relevant examples. So the first example would be the first rune in the runic alphabet, or the futhark. Yes, we have an elder futhark and a younger futhark. The rune fehu means money, cattle, or wealth, and the reason for the repeated carving of this rune on any object you can think of is pretty easy to understand. The second example would be the carving of the T rune, the Tyr rune. It is the name of the rune as well as the name of one of the most powerful Norse gods, Tyr meaning glory in Old Norse. And there are also inscriptions from the pagan period which occasionally invoke the heathen gods themselves, with perhaps the most common formula being, may Thor hallow these runes. So it's not very difficult to imagine why such a writing had caught the imagination of antiquarians from the 15th, 16th, 17th century, not only in Scandinavia but also scholars from Britain and all across Europe. In fact, in Scandinavia they had this very powerful significance that they were seen as the last surviving fragments of a great national literature, probably written by the Goths. And there is one character by the name of Ole Worm who believed that all Norse literature had originally been written in the runic alphabet, which is not true. But in the 17th century, at least, they were understood as an alphabet more than anything else. In the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, the connection between runes and heathen magic was made. So once European scholars became familiar with the Eddic poem Hovamál, for example, with the writings of Snorri Sturluson as well, so the Younger Edda and the Orb of the World, the Heimskringla, they started believing that runes were an invention of the gods, of one god in particular, the arch-magician Odin, and also the idea that these runes must have had some kind of supernatural power, which would explain why the alphabet was suppressed by the Christian church, and then people started not to use them anymore. So looking back at the texts, and when I say the text, I refer as usual to the body of work known as the Poetic Edda from the 13th century, which comprises texts older than the 13th century, as well as Snorri Sturluson's more structured story about the gods, the origins of the world, and many other things he writes about in the Elder Edda. So we have in the Poetic Edda, for example, the poem Skirnismál, which, broadly speaking, is about the god Freyr, who sends his messenger Skirnir to a giant maiden by the name of Gerd to woo her into a marriage with the god Freyr. And among the many methods Skirnir attempts to use in order to achieve his purpose, he mentions carving 3 thorn runes, or Thurs runes as they were known in Scandinavian tradition, a word for an ogre, on her. So this rune is related, for example, in a later runic poem with the idea of tormenting, so somehow being damaging to someone. So this is one example of the actual practice of using runes for magical purposes. And we have another Eddic poem, Sigurdrivumál, the words of the Valkyria Sigurdriva, or Brunhild, where she makes a series of reference to the magical properties of individual runes. So she recommends, for example, carving on a sword the victory rune in order to ensure success in battle. Other than that, we do have examples from the Icelandic sagas as well, but these examples are a little more vague and doubtful, because there is also a lot of Christian thought as well as folklore and superstition in these stories. So in Grettir's saga, for example, we have the hero Grettir, who takes refuge on a rocky island off the coast of Iceland from his enemies, and one of his enemies has an old woman carve a runic inscription on a log and redden it with blood, sending this log in the sea in order to cause Grettir harm, which actually happens, but for a rather different reason, which is the fact that Grettir tries to chop this log for firewood, and he ends up cutting his leg accidentally, which becomes infected and than his enemies. Um, then it is easier for his enemies to attack him. There is also an example from Egil Saga where the hero Egil Skallagrimsson is called to the bedside of a sick child, and he discovers that the child had been cursed by some carved runes on a piece of whalebone, and he scrapes them off, replacing them with better ones, and then the child is cured. So there is definitely in these stories some influence from the Christian miracle stories, even from the saints' lives, and things get a little mixed up. But in both cases, the reference to runes plays a part in developing this idea of them having magical powers. I kept the best for the end of this list of examples, which is the poem Hovamol, the Words of the High One. This is a collection of pieces of wisdom attributed to the god Odin, and at the climax of the poem, Odin describes his ritual of self-sacrifice, sacrificing himself to himself, being resurrected after having acquired wisdom from the world of the dead. This does have some parallels, essential parallels to the Christian myth. However, the metaphors used in the poem, the so-called kenningar, they can also be found in very early skaldic poetry, so this doesn't automatically mean that the story was inspired from Christian mythology. But anyway, one of the things Odin does in the process is to acquire the runes. It is very obscure here. Odin seems to have picked up the runes and screaming while he took them. This has caused a lot of debate among scholars about what it actually means. But anyway, it became the basis of the general belief that Odin invented these runes. And afterwards, he also mentions something about 9 mighty spells he learned from a giant, from his uncle actually, and then he also drinks the mead of poetry. There is also something about healing charms in the poem, so he can perform spells to blunt an enemy's weapons, for example, or to put out fires, also to speak to those who have died by hanging, or even to make himself irresistible to women. So yeah, overall, Odin becomes the creator of runes. And in the 19th century, German nationalism latches to this idea of the idealized Germanic past. It is very preoccupied with the ancient roots of the Germanic peoples, and in other words, it kind of becomes inevitable that Odin and, generally speaking, Norse mythology get dragged into this nationalistic and then racial ideology as well. So the self-image of the Germanic race or folk, the whole concept was to become a central element in the later Nazi ideology, and it was much more than simply the people. It was also a mystical racial identity, and a folkish thought concerned itself not only with history, for that matter, but also with more shady aspects of the supposed racial culture, such as magic, mysticism, and folklore. As a consequence, runes also became very important attraction for mystic nationalism and folkish thought. It is also to be mentioned the fact that such preoccupations were not limited to Germany. They were common throughout Europe at the time, and one of the most celebrated occult circles was the one organized by Elena Blavatsky. She developed a system known as Theosophy, a system that maintained that all ancient religions contained a fundamental spiritual truth, enough to provide a strong basis for a mystical union with the one true God. This esoteric wisdom had been passed on by the initiated members of various secret societies through history, and the origins of the human races could be traced back to a series of mythical prehistoric cycles, with each cycle marked by the rise of a particular root race, with each root race to be greater than the one preceding it. These ideas were further developed by the Austrian nationalist known as Guido von List, who developed the idea of the occult wisdom of the Aryan people, or Ariosophy. He was, as well as Blavatsky's circle, anti-modern, mystical, and very racist. So he wrote accounts of the created generations of giants, argued that the original German pagans, worshippers of the gods of the Norse mythology, had been driven out by Christians to end up in Scandinavia and eventually in Iceland. He published a lot of articles on Norse mythology, but he did not limit himself only to this. He devoted himself to Wotan, so to Odin, as the true god of the German people. So Wotanism was the name given to the religion supposedly practiced by these original Germanic peoples. It was based on a system of esoteric wisdom, supposedly guarded by a secret priesthood. I could not stress this enough. This was made up, most of it, because Norse sources tell us almost nothing regarding how they worshipped, so the ritualistic part is nearly absent from the sources. But anyway, this did not stop him, so he developed this concept of the elite priesthood, also gave it a name, the Armannenschaft, after the name of a tribe mentioned by the Roman historian Tacitus in his Germania. And this secret ruling elite of initiates preserved the ancient Aryan wisdom and could guide the people to a society based on racial purity, patriarchy, and a strict hierarchy. You can see where I'm going with this and why such ideas were eagerly adopted by German nationalists. He also took the runes and turned them into some kind of mystic system. So he thought contrary to what it is actually known. So what is known here, I mean that the shortest alphabet amounted to 16 letters and the longest 24. He was, on the other hand, convinced that the authentic number was 18. So that would be the number of spells in the poem Hovamol. And it was obvious for him that each of the runes that Odin had picked up represented in itself a magical spell, and that each runic character was a powerful site of ancient wisdom, and they basically encoded this wisdom from the ancient Germanic past. And then his followers started seeing runes pretty much everywhere, even in the heraldic devices of Austrian aristocratic families. So these families were themselves considered to be the carriers of the master race. So heraldic symbols were some kind of runes in disguise. And not only this, but also, for example, the patterns of wooden beams on the Fachwerkhäuser, on the half-timbered houses, they would also secretly express some kind of Aryan wisdom. And in other words, runic characters, which were now symbols, had become a powerful icon of German identity, of Aryan identity. And speaking of which, the swastika itself was not a Norse character, but a Hindu symbol for good fortune. Nevertheless, was adopted because of its link with what was believed to be the ancient roots of the Aryan race in India. So these people were not bright at all. On the other hand, the double S rune was to become very familiar as a part of the regalia of the SS, Heinrich Himmler's secret paramilitary organization. Many of the followers of von List went on to belong to societies which more and more became openly racist and anti-Semitic, and they often borrowed name from Old Norse. We have two examples here, the Thule Society and the Edda society. So they were allegedly scholarly societies which were dealing with the investigation, the scholarly investigation of the Norse past, but they were actually influential forums for the spreading of Nazi ideology. So, for example, the Thule Society had direct links to the forerunners of the National Socialist Party, and the founder of the Edda Society, Rudolf Gorsleben, he translated the Edda and derived from it another form of mystical Aryan ancient religion, and also talked about eugenics and racial mixing. He claimed that the universe was permeated by an invisible energy, among other things, emanating from the powerful god of the purest Aryan people, and that runes could attract and channel this energy, forming some kind of electrical link between each individual Aryan man and the creator of the universe. So Heinrich Himmler, for one, was very much influenced by these ideas, and that's why he adopted the runic symbols in the first place. And many supporters of the Nazi regimes were devotees of Norse myth and this more mystical component. Especially the story of Ragnarok was particularly appreciated. This idea of the final battle, because it carried this meaning of the establishment of a holy new world order, some kind of metaphor for the victory of the Third Reich. On the other hand, if Norse myth was a part of this, an important part of this nationalist package, we should also mention that it was really not a defining element of the ideology. It was rather more of an intersection, because while Himmler himself was involved in occult circles, Hitler, for example, dismissed the neo-pagans, so the Votanists, as posers, and he was afraid that it would actually make the Nazi ideology look bad and ridiculous. But these theories about the runes and about Norse myth, although only tangential to actual Nazi politics, they continued a life of their own outside of the doctrine. So, for example, there is a guy by the name of Friedrich Marby who developed a theory known as Runengymnastik. So this involved participants holding yoga-like poses in the shape of runic letters in order to attract to themselves this spiritual energy. There was even a practice of rune yodeling with various kinds of humming and people gathering in magic circles. This Marby guy, alongside other neo-pagans, were actually accused of making the holy Aryan heritage look silly, and they ended up in the concentration camp. But the man who criticized them, Karl Maria Willigut, was himself quite a character. He was an advisor to Himmler on a lot of mystical things. And he had plenty of weird ideas himself. So he considered, for example, that his family were the survivors of an ancient Germanic super tribe of ultimately divine origin, and their chief prophet was called Baldur or Krestos, and he had been crucified by Votanists. So quite the mashup here of pagan and Christian mysticism. And that his own group was persecuted then by Catholics and Jews. He even wrote under the name of Vidar, which was one of the gods who would survive Ragnarok and avenge Odin at the end of the world. So yeah, you can see that all these fantasies do have something in common. So we have megalomania, this complex of persecution, and this idea also prevalent in conspiracy theories of the fact that a small group of people possesses access to ultimate truths, and it is their duty to bring this truth to the world. Many of these ideas, unfortunately, were preserved after the Nazi times as well. They tend to reappear in one form or another, quite controversial in a wide spectrum of New Age activities, and the original connection to nationalism and racism is still a matter of debate among many neo-pagan practitioners. Yeah, this belongs to the problem of reception of Old Norse myth in modern times, which of course it is also a problem for scholars of Old Norse and of the Viking Age, because we tend to be confronted quite often with these interpretations which stem from the 19th and 20th century. And I don't know, I think the reputation of this field of study still has to suffer as a consequence of all the very strange and bizarre theories that had been developed around runes and myth in the past 2 centuries. So I don't know what the future holds in store, but I do hope that this area of studies will no longer be affected by having to distance itself all the time from the more gibberish theories circulating around it. Okay, so I hope you found it at least a little bit entertaining. If you did, I'm going to kindly ask you to hit the subscribe button. If you have some interests of your own, if there is something you would like me to make a video about or to hold a talk about, just write to me in a comment. Thank you so much for listening to me. Take care, and you will hear from me soon.